All right. Right. So maybe another couple of seconds, we still have a pretty good stream of people entering the waiting room. So we'll get started really soon. All right. And let's be off. Welcome back to our third and final session of Neuroscience and Your Behavior. Thank you so much for participating in this series of the Science Lab, sponsored by the Alumni Association at the University of Notre Dame. We spent the first 2 weeks talking about the intersections between Catholic social tradition and interdependence of the brain. We also reflected and learned a lot about how stress during development can moderate brain development and behavior. And so I'm very excited to share with you this last session with you. And we spend so much time on the computer these days. So in some more than anything, I just hope that you feel like your time with us has been well spent. I want to thank those people that submitted questions during the session, after the session, very kind and thoughtful communication. We've had over 1,400 people register for this series, representing 30 countries around the globe. So we're really excited to invite you to continue the community circles when the session is complete. In the community circles, we'll have an opportunity for a little bit more close-knit discussion. And an opportunity to stay engaged, not only within the science lab, but kind of build more of a global and long distance connection. At this time, I'd also like to thank the sponsors. So not only the Alumni Association that sponsors ThinkND, but the College of Science at the University of Notre Dame, College of Arts and Letters, and the Center for Social Concerns. As is our tradition, we will have the community circles after the session is completed. So we'll end the formal programming right about 12:30, and then we'll join the breakout rooms. Those will last until about 12:45 or so. So you're not obligated to stay, but you're welcome to stay and continue the conversation. As you also know, when we're promoting the event, when we reach out to you for the day's session, the links to primer videos and host introductions are available in preparation or for review afterwards. Also, after the sessions are done, the podcasts are posted there as well. So they're available for you to return to at any point in time or share with family, friends, individuals in your community area as well. This week, I am very honored to introduce you to our two guests. We'll be speaking with Dr. Martin Teicher, Director of the Developmental Biopsychiatry Research Program at McLean Hospital and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Kimberly Green-Reeves will also be joining us. She is the Director of Beacon Community Impact for our region's hospital system, Beacon Health System. Dr. Teicher really pioneered the field of the neurobiological consequences of childhood adversity and has inspired countless scientists, including myself, to join the field and to use what we understand about the basic neurobiology of brain development and environmental exposure in really helping kids and building healthier communities. Which leads me to our fabulous Kimberly Green-Reeves, whose birthday is also today. Yay! Kimberly Green-Reeves, and she is going to, as Director of Beacon Community Impact, she uses her deep expertise in directing community health-focused operations for this hospital system and aims to address the health priorities of the area as well as emergent needs that are identified by community health needs assessments. So together, I'm really, really excited to share their expertise, because together, I think that they can offer a remarkably complementary view of how issues of unbuffered stress dose, where we talked about that in the last session, what can be described as childhood adversity. But this idea of unbuffered stress dose can impact not only neurobiology and behavior, but also much broader community health. We're also going to hope to aim to leave the session on a little bit of a more hopeful note and offering some ideas and ways to become engaged so that we can all become better protective factors within our community. So as questions emerge, which I'm sure that they are, a few moments ago in the chat, there's a link to that Google form. So you can submit any questions that you have for any of the speakers on the call. through the Google form, and towards the end of the programming, we will visit those. We'll try to get to most of them. If we don't have an opportunity to, we'll follow up after the session. So without further ado, welcome, you guys. Thank you so much. It really is such an honor to share this time with you. So to get started, can you share a little bit more about yourselves, what inspires you about your work, what fills you about your work? Kimberly, you want to, birthday girl, you want to take the lead on this one?
Sure, happy to. First, I want to thank the University of Notre Dame. Thank you, Dr. Michael, for having me today, as well as thank you for the birthday shout out. So yes, my work with Beacon Community Impact started in 2012. And our mission has really continued to be making sure that we are delivering outstanding care, inspiring health, and ensuring that we're connecting with heart. That being said, it's just a pleasure to be able to work for an organization that is doing such wonderful things. At the core of what we do in our department here with Community Impact, we're preventing disease and promoting health regionally with an emphasis on vulnerable populations. This looks different based on three pillars that we have. Healthcare delivery. So we have individuals who are equipped and ready to deliver programming and address risk factors that come up, making sure that they're positioned well to address the greatest need identified. We also provide healthcare innovation. And so what that may look like is that we're able to offer or shift our focus and strategies as well as investments to incorporate new programming and data-driven approaches. And then finally, we are positioned well and have some great expertise on the team here that can provide capacity building services. What that looks like is educational workshops, direct assistance, collaboration. We're building an opportunity to be data-driven, resilient, and agile, and be able to adapt in a changing environment. And as you mentioned, Dr. Michael, ultimately, all of this work is centered on our CHNA, which we administer every 3 years to ensure that we are not only equipped to handle some of the healthcare issues that come up, but more importantly, they are the top priorities that community stakeholders have identified, our secondary data is able to validate for us, and then finally, it's the voice of the community, which is absolutely important. Another key component of what we do is we lead collaborative work with external non-for-profits who are committed to uplifting health with us. And so we provide grant funding in order to change the narrative or enhance health outcomes. So ultimately, I'm just fortunate to be able to work for an organization that ideally, because of this work, we identified adverse childhood experiences as a priority for us. Back in 2012 is where we initiated our community health needs assessment. And in 2016, we really delve into this work. And ultimately, here in 2021, still doing some phenomenal things alongside community partners as well as organizations.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just for clarity, CHNA is Community Health Needs
Assessment.
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, awesome. And to be able to pivot and be data responsive for such a large health system really is not a small feat. And so it really is amazing just how nimble and responsive community impact is in responding to those emerging needs that arise in our community. Dr. Teicher, how about you? I know that, yeah, can you give the audience just a little bit of background about you and your work, and then we'll get into some good questions for you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Michael. Okay, my view is much smaller than Kimberly's. I'm a lab scientist and also a physician scientist. And much of my work was done and driven to help me better understand the individuals that I've been treating. And I've done research in a variety of areas. I've been at it for a long time, close to 50 years. And the stuff that I've been doing most recently, looking at the effects of childhood adversity on the developing brain, which has now been going on for nearly 30 years, has really been the most exciting area of research that I've pursued. And it's been fascinating what we've learned about the brain and how plastic the brain is and how specifically it is altered by the types of experiences that we've had in our lives. Initially when I started doing the research, the thinking was that stress was just bad for the brain, and particularly bad for the developing brain. And that the research sort of began with the framework that early life stress was damaging the brain, and we were dealing with the consequences of brain damage. And eventually it dawned on me that that really didn't make sense, that through all the eons of evolution, that it makes that the brain didn't adapt to be dealt with early life stress, since that's really been part of our ancestry. And so what the alternative is that the brain is being selectively modified by this exposure, basically to survive childhood and to go on and to successfully reproduce. And it's modified in very specific and very selective ways by this experience, which may have helped the individual survive their childhood and go on to pass along their genes, but may be very maladaptive in the life that they're facing after childhood. And so we're really understanding now psychiatry from this perspective of these experiences altering our biology and then predisposing us to have certain kinds of behavioral traits and symptoms that are a consequence of our early experience, and that are embedded deeply in our brain, and then trying to understand this and disentangle this to develop better ways of preventing the emergence of psychiatric disorders, and better ways of treating individuals who do have maltreatment-associated psychiatric problems.
Yeah, and it really is just fascinating, right? So it actually leads very well into my first question, because you talked about that these different periods that the field has experienced, right? That, like, stress was bad for the brain, and then stress was brain damage. We'll come back to it in a minute, but this idea that the changes in brain architecture really are an adaptation, and they're selective modification. Notre Dame had the opportunity. Dr. Teicher graciously agreed to be a visiting scholar in the spring semester last year. And so I got spoiled a little bit and was able to sit on some of his classes that he was doing with the undergraduates. And I remember sitting in class, and it was probably early on in the semester. And so this is a two-part question. And you told a story about your patients, and you talked about it was the first 3 patients that you ever put into a scanner, right? And with the questions about this adaptation piece, right? That it's not brain damage, but like what's happening in the brains of these individuals, and questioning whether or not experience can change brain structure. And then the part of the story that really, really struck with me was that, and then you talked about how you sat on those data, that you didn't publish, right? The data that came out of those images, I think you said for like 2 or 3 years after you had it. And so I was wondering if you could share a little bit of this story with our guests here today.
Sure. Let me retell the story a bit. It's a little
bit better.
So the way I began in this line of research was as a consequence of 3 patients that I had early in my practice. I was still a resident. And these 3 individuals all had a number of things in common. They would be diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, a very severe case, which is sort of like the Sharon Stone character in Fatal Attractions. These individuals have very, very unstable interpersonal relationships, and they can go from seemingly very logical and very rational to incredibly negatively emotional. They also seem to have a typical bipolar disorder. And what I picked up in my assessments was they also had symptoms suggestive of temporal lobe epilepsy. And in temporal lobe epilepsy, it's called psychomotor epilepsy, you have many dissociative type symptoms and strange sensations and things like olfactory hallucinations and symptoms like that, sort of Alice in Wonderland effects where you see perceptual distortions, and they had these things. And so I had them all go for EEGs. All 3 of them had abnormal EEGs. They did benefit to some degree from adding an anticonvulsant to their treatment. And we also had them scanned. This is before I was doing research in the area. This was just clinical to have them scanned. And 2 of the 3 had evidence for mesial temporal sclerosis on the scan, which is basically thinning of the hippocampus. And so their brains were rather abnormal. And the realization that dawned on me, and it was not a eureka moment, but sort of a more gradual awakening, was that these individuals also had histories of childhood adversity. And the dawning realization was, did childhood adversity lead to these alterations in their brain and their symptoms? Now, this was back in 1984 or so. And today, that doesn't sound at all like a radical thought. Back in 1984, that was a very radical thought. McLean, which is one of the country's premier psychiatric hospitals, a Harvard teaching hospital, back in 1984 was divided between the biological camp and the psychoanalytic camp. And as a resident in training, you had to avoid the landmines between the different areas. And the thinking at the time was that there were psychiatric disorders that were inherited, that were brain-based, like schizophrenia, like bipolar disorder, that you treated with medications. And then there were other psychiatric disorders that came as a consequence of poor relationships with parents and other significant figures, and that these were basically software problems, and that you needed to treat those with psychotherapy. And so I was sort of changing the model and saying, no, these experiences aren't just encoded in our, in our software. These are actually structurally, physically changing their brains. And so you lose the separation between the two, and you begin to have an intersectionality between the experiences and the functioning brain. So this sort of dawned on me. Then, and I presented that at a meeting around that time in Spain, but to really move this forward, I needed to get research. And then back in 1986 or so, I had a position at the hospital, which is the job I really wanted at the hospital, which was director of the psychopharmacology in the outpatient clinic. And as part of that, we started to do some research, and the individuals came into the outpatient clinic. And one of the individuals was interested in early life experiences and collecting data on that. And I created an instrument to assess how frequently individuals had these symptoms suggestive of temporal lobe epilepsy, and found that their reporting having had physical and sexual abuse markedly increased the likelihood that they would have clinically significant symptoms suggestive of temporal lobe epilepsy. And so this, we finished and processed that data around 1990 or so. At that time, I also published a case report series, the first time describing the emergence of intense suicidal preoccupation on Prozac, fluoxetine. And psychiatry had previously been aware that some people could become more suicidal on antidepressants, but the thought was that these individuals are suicidal to begin with, and the antidepressant energized them so they might make an action. What we reported was quite different, was that people could develop de novo suicidal ideation on the medication. And that article received enormous attention, 2020, 60 Minutes, Nightline, things like that. And so there was a lot of publicity, a lot of attention. And I was really very, very wary about publishing something else that was going to be disruptive to the field at the time. So I literally sat on that paper for 3 years before I felt that the field was ready to hear that. Yeah. And then we also then had an EEG series that supported the data by showing that there were EEG abnormalities that went along with that. So basically trying to provide the first data that there was a biological shift in the brain because of childhood adversity. I really needed to be 100% sure, and I really needed to also feel that the field might be ready to hear it.
Yeah, you touched on so many critical components in terms of this conversation in general, right? That easily within most perhaps of our guests' lifetimes, that the field and the field of medicine really has gone through a really, dynamic, life-changing shift in perspective, right? And just in terms of just social change and cultural change, I think culturally we're still very, very much rooted in in many areas, right? A very hardware versus software problem. And so when we want to address these issues in a community setting, right, it's not only about the evidence, right? So from the initial discovery point from the scientific literature, but then how is that evidence disseminated? How is that evidence communicated? How does that evidence not only make it out into the broader community, but then how do we develop best practice based off of really what ultimately becomes neurobiological expectation? So I'm wondering, you mentioned earlier in your response, and I'm sure that there's way too much to cover on the phone call, right? You could probably get like a doctoral degree in this, but these selective adaptations, could you do us a favor and just describe, you mentioned in your first patients that you saw changes in the hippocampus, which is the brain's kind of major site for learning and memory and spatial navigation, contextual information. But we talk a lot about in the field, these structure function relationships, right? So the hippocampus is a structure, its function is associated with learning and memory, spatial navigation. So could you select like a handful, right? Maybe give us a taste of like 2 or 3 different structures that you see change as a result of different, and you mentioned also that the different types of adversity. So it really is a selective modification based on the experience. But could you just give us some examples of what that means in the context of brain structure and how that changes the function and how that might impact the behavior of an individual?
Sure, happy to. I think one of the most fascinating sets of observations that we made was on the impact of specific types of childhood maltreatment. So we looked at individuals who had high levels of exposure to parental verbal abuse and no other really form of maltreatment. We looked at individuals who had witnessed multiple episodes, visually witnessed multiple episodes of domestic violence, where generally their mother was seen being physically assaulted. And we examined individuals who had reported experiencing childhood sexual abuse, in this case, basically outside the family. So they weren't experiencing other types of maltreatment within the family, but they were experiencing sexual abuse in an extrafamiliar manner. And we did global whole brain analysis. So we took the data from their scans, put it into the computer, and basically had the computer delineate what alterations in the brain were most significantly associated with that experience. So we didn't bias it in any way to look at a particular brain region. And what it turned out was we looked at parental verbal abuse. It modified the volume of specifically the auditory cortex. And it affected the integrity of 3 major fiber pathways in the brain, but the one that it affected the most is the arcuate fasciculus, which interconnects the Broca and Wernicke's language center and is a critically important language pathway. So verbal abuse was affecting auditory processing and language. In contrast, visually witnessing domestic violence affected the volume of the visual cortex, and it affected one pathway, inferior longitudinal fasciculus, which interconnects the visual cortex with the limbic system and determines the memory and emotional response we have to things that we see. We also found that sexual abuse affected other portions of the visual cortex, particularly those involved in facial recognition. And then a colleague, Christine Heim, did another study looking at sexual abuse, and she found selective thinning in the somatosensory cortex, which is responsible for touch and feeling, and the specific portion of the somatosensory cortex that conveys touch and feeling from the clitoris and surrounding genital area. So basically, we're finding that specific types of abuse were modifying the sensory systems that conveyed that information, and probably altering how much we perceive this, at least consciously, in a way to help them make it through their childhood. The other way that the brain is affected, and these tie into this, is how we process and detect threats. And this is something that many brain regions are devoted to, this process of this is very critical for survival, being able to detect a threat and being able to have a fight or a flight or a freeze response to a threat. And this sensory information is critical in terms of determining if there's a threat. And it turns out that there are 2 pathways into the system. There's a pathway that goes through your sensory regions in which you perceive the response. And there's also a very direct pathway from the thalamus to the amygdala, which is the central portion of this threat detection system that occurs below the level of consciousness. And it looks like maltreatment is altering the component of the system that has to do with the conscious perception of the threat, but leaving intact the unconscious perception of the threat, or a little bit below that. And then what we found, which is most fascinating in looking at the response of the amygdala and the response of the hippocampus, which is a critical important component to that system in terms of bringing contextual memories in to determining whether something's a threat or not. And the amygdala is sort of making this decision and then activating other portions of the brain to direct a fight or flight or a freeze response. And that what we really learn now is that it's complicated because it really depends on the age of the exposure. And so if you're exposed to stressors like pure bullying or something in that order, in the teenage years, it modifies your system so that it becomes better at detecting threats and it responds more vigorously to a threat. And this is useful because as a teenager, you can then avoid situations where you might be seriously bullied. On the other hand, if this happened early in life and you're experiencing certain kinds of parental abuse, say 4, 5, 6 years of age, what it actually did was it blunted the response. And so you had less of a response to the threat. And this may be critical in terms of a 4, 5, 6-year-old can't mount an effective fight or flight response if they're being abused by their parents. But in order to maintain the attachment bond, it may be necessary to blunt the fight or flight response to sustain the attachment. But then these changes become enduring and they're present in adulthood. And so having this enhanced fight or flight response or threat response is problematic because you may misinterpret neutral events as threatening. And this will markedly increase your risk for developing anxiety disorders and depression. And having the blunted response makes it harder for you to recognize threats, makes you act impulsively, and increases your risk for substance abuse.
Yeah. So there's so much there, right? And so much there in the context of, right, like it really illustrates this abundance of understanding of brain development and experience that the literature really holds, but then, right, again, this kind of delayed translation out of the field, I think it still puts community health not in jeopardy, but it's not elevating community health in the ways that we could if we found active ways to kind of deploy that information. So in the context then for Kimberly and your work with the community health needs assessment, you mentioned that in 2012 was really the first time that the community identified childhood adversity as a critical health need to be addressed, an emerging health need. And that showed up again in 2015. 2018 has looked a little bit different, but I want to revisit some of the things that Marty mentioned in this idea of the experience. So not only the age of experience, but the type of experience. Changes brain structure and function, but ultimately, and correct me if I'm misparaphrasing, but that the conscious perceptions become changed or modified based on the age and type, but the unconscious, the threat detection system remains intact. And so from an experiential behavior, right, or experience as an individual, it's almost like we can become very, very unaware consciously of these things that might be triggering this really powerful and rapid stress response. And the literature really demonstrates in terms of ACEs, which in this context, again, not Alliance for Catholic Education, all you domers on the call, but adverse childhood experiences, that it's really this kind of chronic and unbuffered stress dose that leads to so many of the persistent kind of prolonged health problems that we associate. So with all of that in the background, when Beacon, like what was that journey like? Beacon discovered childhood adversity as a major health concern, and how has that awareness informed Beacon Community Impact's approach in perspective of community health? How, and right in terms of like this really remarkably nimble and data responsive unit that you run, like what are you doing differently? And so how did it inform your approach? And then what are some strategies that you're doing differently?
Absolutely. So for us, it was an aha moment. And I think at that moment, we had to take some real time to really understand how we wanted to position ourselves in the community, and not really understanding exactly what that meant. We went on a journey. And fascinating to hear Dr. Teicher speak. We were able to learn a lot from his research through the ACE interface, which is with Dr. who was with the CDC, and Dr. Folletti, who did the original adverse childhood experiences study. From that information, including Dr. Teicher's input, we were then able to educate ourselves. But more importantly, I think what came out of that was that we needed to identify a common language. In healthcare, when you say the word trauma, it means different. We are a trauma 2 healthcare system, and so we are very aware of having patients come to us that have had traumatic experience. That may be a motor vehicle accident, a fall, a gunshot wound. So to say that we were going to address trauma really provided this atmosphere, if you will, of just uncertainty and kind of a high mountain to climb. And so we really had to think about what we meant when we said we wanted to embark on this, and really took that information from ACE Interface to help understand best how we could position ourselves in the community. In addition to that, we brought alongside who we call 50 master trainers that were able to learn about this information. And for us, our theory of change is to make someone aware. So we're going to make someone aware that ACEs exist, but that they can also be mitigated. The impacts of trauma can be mitigated, and what that means. And then when you're providing that knowledge, the hope there is then we're able to put some tangible things in place, again, to change the narrative. And so really starting with educating ourselves, and then moving into, now that we're in a training position, we can start to really think about what are some of the tangible responses that we're going to have. Does that mean that we're going to shift programming? Does that mean that we're going to go out and identify new programming? And we have to be careful about using the word best practice, because we want to get the right fit for the community in which we serve. And I think that's another narrative that we've had to change and a shift, because in healthcare, at least from my perspective in community health, evidence-based practices, they mean a lot, right? They mean that we can go after what's intended and have health outcomes as a result based on that evidence-based practice, but it doesn't always mean that is right for the community in which we serve. And then ultimately understanding that although we have a vertical, when we're really focusing on adverse childhood experiences, that it really permeates throughout all of our work. And so really understanding what does that mean, and how can we continue to shift the awareness that we were initially in to more of a responsive, where we have some tangible and practical solutions for not only preventing ACEs, but again, lessening the impact of what comes about. And then really at this point, changing this whole idea of thinking that we're just going to do an initiative and really start moving and calling it a movement, I should say. Right. And so when we think about child adversity, thinking about all adversity that trauma can have on someone, looking at it through the lens of health equity, right? And how are we going to address disparities and look at social factors differently? When we say a strength-based approach, how is it no longer just going to be beacon leading it? How are we going to know when it's our turn to either step up or step back, right? And allow other stakeholders to use their resources and their expertise to be able to work with us on this, and then not to lose sight of the community. The community plays a huge role in this, and they are experts. And so while we have a professional lens through our training, they also have a lens of expert through their experience and their environment that they can bring to the table. And so for us, it's been a journey. As I mentioned before, we started in 2012 with the initial assessment. It wasn't until 2016 that we were actually able to start the training. And right now we're at a point where we're starting to have different programming and strategies be put in place to really understand what this means for healthcare, but grateful that we're making progress along the way.
Yeah. And I want to, there are a couple of things that I'd like to revisit, right? The time point that you talked, right, from the identification to being able to do something, the really, really intentional reflection that happened, right? And the data collection and the learning, right? That it wasn't just this kind of reactive strategy to go out and grab the easiest thing that's off the shelf, but really taking the time to, you articulated it so well, the idea of best practice versus best fit, right? That in a lot of disciplines, there might be best practices that are deployed, but that best practice, if you change the context of it, might not be the best fit and therefore the most efficacious in a community setting and solving some of these issues. And so also, right, so I think that kind of time that passed is also very reflective in the time that passed from kind of initial discovery to publication that Marty talked about earlier too. In the context then of health equity and community voice, I think that's one of the things that I love so much about Beacon Community Impact, is that you guys really not only ask for voice, but then you provide resources and funding and elevate voices of the community and elevate services within the community that really are best fit for our local neighborhoods in our broader region. But I think, Marty, if you can do me a favor and just briefly make the link. So we're talking about health equity, right? And we're talking about kind of stress dose. So we use the language of childhood adversity a lot, but I think that can limit our view oftentimes in thinking about, in that seminal ACEs paper, there were 10 events that were on the survey. And so when we use the term ACEs, I think it can kind of narrow the view of all of the environmental factors that can create persistent stress on a system, right? So in the context of health equity, right, we know that ACEs are correlated with a lot of health outcomes. We know that there's social and environmental factors, right? And the term in the literature that's used is social determinants of health, but they're really social correlates of health. Could you briefly, for our audience, Marty, could you talk about just how stress is a moderator, really persistent like HPA activation, and how that can be a moderator then of outcomes like heart disease, right? I think it's probably easy for a lot of us to understand, like, oh yeah, chronic stress, you might end up depressed, or you might end up with a substance use disorder, but like heart disease, cancer, like, can you just give us a 2-minute elevator pitch kind of explanation?
Sure. So as we're all familiar with, when you have stress, you have hormonal responses to the stress. On one level, we have a adrenaline response that may enable us to run or fight, and we also have a cortisol response. And this cortisol response is absolutely essential for life. If you have damage to your adrenals and you can't mount this cortisol response, you will die if you're overly stressed. And cortisol in part shuts down the adrenal response, but it's very, very critical. And one of the things that happens with cortisol is that it also is a very strong anti-inflammatory agent. And so it turns out that with maltreatment or early life adversity, that you can have two alterations, two different ways your stress system can go. Your stress system can either be hyper responsive to stress, and you can have high levels of cortisol, and that may happen particularly with things like sexual abuse, or you can have wind up over time with a blunted stress response and have lower overall levels of cortisol. And that particularly happens with very early exposure. And then that effects on inflammation are quite powerful. So if you blunt your inflammation, you're blunting your immune response. And so your system is down in terms of immunology and immune protection. And so that's going to increase your likelihood of developing cancers. On the other hand, if you have increased cortisol and it blunts your immune response, you're going to have increased risk. If you blunt your cortisol and you have high levels of inflammation, that becomes one of the critical determinants of heart disease, is this high level of inflammation. So on one hand, you're very likely to develop an inflammatory process which may set you up for autoimmune diseases and for a high risk of heart disease, or you may have a blunted immune response, which will set you up to make you susceptible to more types of infections and will also increase your risk of developing cancer.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. And I hope that the folks that are joining us today appreciate that as well, because it really is, it sometimes feels like such a leap from, again, right, in terms of culture, it hasn't been that long since the field really started making these discoveries that this isn't a hardware versus a software problem, that you can't just like suck it up and get over it, right? That if we don't develop those protective factors for individuals, that this really can become a chronic and long, although adaptive in the moment. Right? We talked in the first two sections about this kind of obligate nature of a developing neurobiology to attach. And so if that source of attachment is also the source of stress, there are going to be adaptations within a physiological system to be able to maintain that relationship. But then those adaptations become persistent and then maladaptive, right? It becomes kind of a dysregulated physiological and neurobiological output in the long run. So I appreciate you're taking the time to make that explicit link in terms of how that becomes like a physiological thing too, that the systems aren't indeed not separate at all, or they're very, very interconnected. And so kind of within that, thinking about health equity in a community system, Kimberly, you talked about the uncertainty with like when we discovered this need in our community and the uncertainty with which like what do you do with that, right? When part of that discovery and part of that time to discover what is already existing, what have other communities done, you mentioned not only the ACE interface, but I know many organizations in the community have started to consider a trauma-informed response or trauma-informed care. And so can you share with us how does the understanding of ACEs inform some decisions or motivations for organizations to engage in trauma-informed care? And is trauma-informed care just for the healthcare system, or can other people think about that too?
Right. I'll start with the latter so that you can start to think about that as I'm going through the different steps. But the answer to that is no, it's not just for the healthcare system. In fact, we're hoping that it's a cross sector collaborative and work that is applied to this particular model. But trauma-informed care is really looking at a four-phase process, if you will, starting with trauma-aware. And as I mentioned previously, trauma-aware is ensuring that you have all of the knowledge and information that will help to inform you of how stress, the implications of stress and stress dose has on someone. And more importantly, I think that it does not have to be their destiny, that it is preventative. And so when you understand that from a trauma-aware perspective, you start to move into what we consider trauma-sensitive. And trauma-sensitive is really looking at yourself, really understanding how am I set up to be able to engage with someone that has been traumatized, or even start this conversation as an organization. Do I have the capacity, or does an individual have a capacity to be able to engage? One of the things that I tend to think about is, for us, staff burnout is important. Whether or not we have the support or we're giving the support to our staff in order to show up differently for the clients or patients that they're going to engage in. And then back to that self-efficacy. And I think all of that is extremely important when looking at trauma sensitive. And then we move into trauma responsive. And trauma responsive is, what are those tangible things that we can do? That's where the protective factors come up. And so, for example, a few of those might be looking at nurturing and attachment, the knowledge of child development. I believe Dr. Valentino touched on this last week when she spoke, the support of social connections. And so as I'm reading all of these, I'm thinking to myself, this can't just be Beacon, right? This can't just be the University of Notre Dame or Dr. Teicher. This has to be a collaborative movement that we are creating as a community in order to make sure that we can heal together. And then when you're in the trauma responsive, again, you're really looking at that best fit. There may be some other things, best practices that would be appropriate, but ultimately, what's the best fit for the community in which you're engaging with, the individual in which you're having that encounter with, and then moving to trauma-informed. Trauma-informed is looking at, how do we reduce stigma? What policies do we want to put in place to ensure that as an organization, we're set up differently to engage and to ensure that we have health outcomes that ultimately are not going to lead to some of the things that Dr. Teicher has just mentioned. We want to ensure that we're able to effectively improve health outcomes, both mentally and physically. We want to also make sure that, because we understand that as an individual who has been traumatized, this is not only interrelated, but transgenerational. And so this can be passed on. We want to make sure that that is not the case. And so ultimately, this is something that we can all do together and something that we have to do with intention. More importantly, I want to stress that it's going to take time, but we have to start somewhere. And I do believe that we have some phenomenal organizations here in our region doing some great work.
Yeah, it will absolutely take time, but I agree, right? That earlier on you said that it's going to be a high mountain to climb, but really, if you think about the impact, not only on an individual, but on like children and communities, I think that it really calls us to consider that we don't have a choice, right? Once this idea of awareness has been accomplished, which for if you're watching this, you can all consider yourselves now trauma aware, right? The idea that it's not a dichotomy between software and hardware, that our experiences actually change and can change persistently, body and brain and physiology. And so that kind of calls us to all consider taking the next step in terms of trauma sensitivity. And so we're being reflective about our own experiences, our own narratives that we tell ourselves regarding like how we feel or how we don't feel or how we engage with other people. And Kimberly, really, in light of being a high mountain to climb, right? That this work is not an initiative, right? You know, I think we're all initiative out, right? Like this month it's going to be this, and this academic year it's going to be this, right? That this is a commitment that we make. I mean, you know, for all those people that you care about, for yourself, for your kids, for our children, for our communities. But that this is a long goal, and it takes everybody becoming engaged. So I'm going to flip over to the questions that have come in for our audience for a second. Dr. Teicher, this one is for you. Can you give a specific example of a therapy or approach that has been shown to be effective in overcoming a maladaptive response?
Excellent question. There's really been a paucity of research on effective treatments. We know that there are some. The one that I would sort of recommend if somebody was having a very maladaptive response to a stressor might be eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a technique where you're trying to get a person in a particularly relaxed state while they're having conjugate eye movements, and then helping them deal with and process the traumatic event. And that can work very quickly in terms of helping individuals not have certain kinds of traumatic reactions to reminders of the trauma. So that's probably one. There's trauma-focused CBT. What hasn't been done to any large extent is to sort of verify neurobiologically how effective these treatments are. We know that in terms of treatment outcome, that individuals can do substantially better. How much they've actually in turn modified the brain is less clear. We've published a series of studies now, a small series, looking at mindfulness as an intervention, which seems to affect the amygdala and seems to affect the hippocampus. But a lot more work has been done to really give you a good answer to that question.
Sorry, I was still muted. I think that's a great start, though. Knowing that there are options, right? That there and on the resources link in the first week, there's a link to 2 books. One is The Body Keeps the Score, where like the third part of that book, I believe it's the third or fourth part, is all these various treatment options and ways that have been clinically shown to be really efficacious in healing trauma. Because I think that's the thing, right? Like burying it doesn't actually solve the problem. It just makes it worse for ourselves. And then we have the higher likelihood of passing it on to our children and within our community. So lots of different options available. This one is for Miss Kimberly Green Reeves. Could you give specific examples of community programs that Beacon is working on? Are they in neighborhoods, schools, or are they offered to businesses?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question. Programs that we're working on are centered on our four priority areas. Healthy family. So we have a large portion of our associates who are addressing maternal infant health through our WIC clinic. It's our Women and Infants Clinic. We also have maternal infant health support through our perinatal care coordination program. We have a dad's program because we don't want to forget that the fathers play a crucial role in the upbringing and caring for an infant. And then also we have programs that really look to mitigate other risks, such as our car seat program, our safe sleep program, and ensuring too that we are able to address any other smoking risk that may be posed to the family. And so we have a particular program that's working through our state funding in that way. In addition to that, we're also in a lot of the public schools providing programming on mental health, looking at the impacts of suicide and how we can play a crucial role in prevention. Also addressing some of the most recent epidemics with substance use. And so we have an opioid program, as well as a program that looks at various substance uses. And then finally, looking at sexual health comprehension. And so it varies from our healthy family priority to our healthy spirit priority, which is looking at substance abuse, and mental health is certainly within that. In particular, when it comes to looking at our resiliency initiative, if you will, that is out of our work with adverse childhood experiences. Right now, we are working very closely with our own system as well as partners, but within our own system, we've done a couple different programs to ensure that, for example, physicians at one of our clinics that looks at the vulnerable population is well equipped in their understanding of stress dose and what things to consider when patients are coming in. We've also did the same thing for our trauma department, looking at the burnout and it's the ability to keep compassion. So we looked at compassion fatigue, if you will, making sure that we could provide supportive services. So those are just a few examples of what we provide in the community.
Where a few is like more than a dozen, right? Like here is this amazing, greatly diverse, different sets of offerings based on need of community.
And I will just add too that it is not without funding, without grants that we're looking at. So we have some state grants, federal, as well as local foundations that support us in this work, that we're able to be as expansive as we are with our work.
Yeah, and also to the community funding, right? That in addition to the larger systems that are offered within the health network, Beacon also funds, I don't want to say like startups, but local commute through the funding and through community grant possibility or community grant funds, whatever the right word is, right?
Yeah. Funds will work.
There we go. All right. Funds community organizations to, again, right, to Kimberly's point, that this is not something that Beacon can do alone. If we're serious about climbing this mountain, and we all very much should be, that it's a job for all of us to lean into and do what we can to lend our skills to helping solve. And so Beacon also supports those local organizations to lend to the not initiative, to just the movement, to the dedication to building healthier communities for our children, because we always talk about kids as if they're our future, and that's how we always, but they're here now, and their neurobiologies are here now, and we have to take care of them now. We can't just continue kind of along the path of least resistance and expect them to just be like 30 years old and everything's fine, right? Yeah.
I just would like to point out that if you really want to do good, that the very top of my list would be what Kimberly is talking about and doing. Preventing childhood adversity, mitigating the consequences of childhood adversity, will be so powerful. It may take 20 years to see it, but it will be so absolutely powerful. I mean, think about it. It's responsible for 45% of childhood onset psychiatric disorders, about 50% of cases of depression, 50% of cases of alcohol abuse, almost 2/3 of serious drug abuse, and a big risk factor for the most significant causes of death, like heart disease and cancer. And if you can mitigate that factor, you will do so much good in the world that just can't emphasize the importance and the power of what you're doing.
Thank you so much, Bernie.
Thank you.
Yeah. And the cool thing about that is that humans are positioned based on kind of this obligate interdependent neurobiology. We are in the best position to become the best protective factors for others within our community. And so in the last couple of minutes that we're gonna play our song one more time, but I want us to be thinking about the song in the context of now, and then a song in the context of everything that we've experienced in a global pandemic and a renewed fight against racism in this last year, how much our own resource might serve as a buffer to experiencing the dramatic stressors that others might have experienced. Maybe our resources became destabilized in the last year. Maybe we had people to turn to, maybe we didn't. I think we have a moment in the time leading up to reopening where we can really look at what we know about brain development, about stress dose, about community health, how these things impact community health. And we have time to make a very explicit choice to consider engaging differently. And really, right, based on the synaptic potentiation, if we're not really explicit and intentional, it's really, really easy just to default back to the way that it was. But I think that this pandemic has been one thing that has been a universal experience, and we've all been hit by it differently. So as we listen to our piece for today, think about your community and your experience in this last year and the experiences of others who may have more or less access or resource. And just consider, what responsibility do we all have to contribute our skills, right? It might not be the best practice, but best practice for our communities and for our families is not always going to be best fit. So how do we have an opportunity to use all of our unique skills and experiences and an opportunity to serve justice in the healing that comes with the reopening after this pandemic? And so if we can go ahead and get our song playing.
This is for the busted hearts. This is for the question marks. This is for the outcast soul, lost control, no one knows. Sing it for the can't go back. Sing it for the broken past. Sing it for the just found out. Life is now upside down. If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand. We're gonna make it through this hand in hand. And if we fall, we will fall together.
This is for the second chance. This is for the new romance. Singing for the left in vain. Overcame, it's not too late.
If you're looking for hope tonight, raise your hand. If you feel alone and don't understand, if you're fighting the fight of your life, then stand. We're gonna make it through this hand in hand. And if we fall, we will fall together. Together with our differences, together we are bolder, braver, stronger.
I love that last lyric. Love that last lyric. Together we are bolder, braver, and stronger. And I think a lot of that, the why, is supported by this interdependent nature of human neurobiology. So for those of us that are still around and are participating in our community circles, our 2 questions for consideration was, how has your understanding of kind of the balance of stress dose and interdependence and protective factors evolved over the last 3 weeks together? Or what new insights, really put more simply, what new insights do you have about brain and your behavior, or brain and others' behavior? Question number 2 is, how can you take what you've learned during your time together and become a stronger protective factor? Maybe for yourself, maybe for someone else, maybe to engage in your community just a little bit differently, to really help not only prevent, but also mitigate the impact. It is a high mountain to climb, but it's a good mountain to climb, right? I think that we need to climb it. We need to make that choice. So see you in the breakout rooms, in the circles.